Texas is the home of many strange and interesting phenomena. Hauntings, dogman sightings, and even the black-eyed children can be found here in droves. But it is also the home of hundreds of UFO sightings, and one particularly striking encounter taking place in the 1980s would present us with the potentially frightening consequences of potential extraterrestrial contact. Welcome back to UFOs Revisited. My name is Aaron Deese, and with me again are Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Seth Breedlove. Welcome back, everyone. So what do we know about what is commonly referred to today as the Cash Landrum incident?
Well, Aaron, this is one of those really incredible cases because really it kind of leaves us asking, do we have technologies that remain unaccounted for? Is this something else, i.e. theirs? And if so, does the United States military still have some sort of a strange role in all of that? But as far as the facts, December 29th, 1980, we have Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and her grandson Colby. And they're on their way back from dinner, and it's, of course, the holiday season. I think that they'd hoped to go out and maybe play bingo, and that wasn't happening with a lot of places being closed right around Christmas. And so as they're coming back from a dinner at a truck stop, heading down the highway, they see a light in the distance. Initially, they think it's probably the oncoming light of an aircraft that's going to land. As they round the corner and get up close enough, there's obviously something hovering over the highway, producing a large amount of light. And so Betty, who's driving, pulls up. She's pretty close to the object, and she gets out of the car to take a look at this. And the general description that's given of the object was that it was sort of diamond-shaped. The top and the bottom would have been cut off so that it didn't go to a point. It was flattened on the top and the bottom, but there were flames being emitted from the bottom. And that as the object is hovering, occasionally it would shoot flames out and it would rise up again, and then it would kind of slowly descend. There's a lot of heat being produced. You would imagine even in Texas on December 29th in the evening, it's going to be pretty chilly outside, but they said that it just felt, quite warm outside and almost as bright as day with all the light that's being emitted by this object, both from the flames, which somewhat obscured a really good look at the craft. But Betty particularly said that there were also some smaller lights, I think blue lights, around the center of this craft. So they watched this, and at one point Vicki got out of the car to look at it briefly as well, but Colby was pretty disturbed by what he was seeing. And I think Vicki was too, and so both perhaps to console Colby, but also maybe to reassure herself, she said, "Don't worry, that's Jesus. He won't hurt us." She's literally likening this light that she's seeing to a religious experience. And that's something maybe that happens more than we would think in UFO cases like this. But Betty spends the longest period outside the vehicle, and when she goes to get back in the car, she had said that touching the metal handle of the door, it actually hurt her hand, and she had to use her jacket to be able to open the door. Vicki, on the other hand, had placed her hand on the dashboard, and they had said that apparently due to the extreme heat, that her handprint had been left on the dashboard and remained there after all of this. Now, one of the really strange things apart from the object that's being seen is that there are also a series of what were described as being Chinook helicopters, black Chinook helicopters that come in and they sort of escort this object out. And as the object takes off and flies away, the helicopters are seen moving away with it. Betty and Vicki and Colby resume their journey, and they get on down the highway, and once they get beyond the tree line, they can see the object moving off into the distance, accompanied by these helicopters. And it was a rather eventful night. They think, okay, wow, well, that was really something. By the time they get home, Betty takes Vicki and Colby home. She gets home herself. Betty's feeling pretty bad. And as her condition seems to worsen, Vicki, who also was suffering from some apparent effects of having been in close proximity to this object, this UFO, the night before, takes Betty in for care. And she was so drained and suffering so badly that she was having a hard time even communicating and remembering who her care provider was. So I think this prompted Vicki to go to the local pharmacy and to ask about Betty's prescription so that they could get the name of her doctor. In any case, Betty was found to have lost hair and in fact actually had been diagnosed with a kind of hair loss. She had this irritation to the skin that was likened to sunburns, and ultimately it had been suggested, and this is popularly associated with this case even still today, that effects of exposure to non-ionizing radiation or radiation poisoning might have been what the witnesses experienced. Although there's some problems about that, and we can get into that as we discuss this case, because other experts have said that if indeed radiation poisoning with those symptoms were the case, and at that prolonged exposure level and that proximity, that distance to the object, I mean, if it had been radiation, this would have been a lethal dose. And since the witnesses died, perhaps it couldn't be radiation. But if not, I mean, what was going on? Some skeptics have even tried to argue that Cash and Landrum may have had pre-existing experiences and conditions, but that they were trying to associate these things with the incident, which I find to be pretty dubious. It seems pretty evident that there had indeed been health effects of some kind from what they witnessed. But the greater question is, what did they witness? I mean, what was this object? Is it ours, a secret military aircraft that was being tested, or other kind of device, if not an aircraft? It certainly seemed to be flying, but what was this? What was its purpose? And if it's not ours, why were there Chinooks? Why were there helicopters that seemed to be associated with the Air Force or some other military agency? Because there are questions about whether the Air Force was involved too, and that also we'll explore here in a moment. What do you guys think about this one?
I think this is an important case for several reasons. I mean, we have evidence, right? But the shape of the craft, the time, 1980, that was the Rendlesham case, was around that same time.
I mean, literally within, like, I think 48 hours,
yeah,
right?
It was very close to the Rendlesham case. We have the flames coming out of the bottom, and 16 to 24 Chinook helicopters unmarked. And this is the first case, too, that they actually filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government claiming injuries, personal injuries. We have evidence of the injuries. So I think, and unfortunately, and it kind of angers me a little bit, that we have all this evidence, and they claim that since the Chinook helicopters had no markings, they're not ours, we're not responsible, but yet it's highly suspicious that they were there, they were seen by others, they're escorting this thing, and does that make them responsible for what they encountered? And it's very sad. I mean, this affected their lives in really bad ways.
Katie, you said two things that are very important, I think, in this narrative, and that is that Cash and Landrum and Colby were not the only witnesses. In the intervening months that followed, there were multiple people that came forward and said they also had witnessed a large object in the sky and that they had also witnessed the helicopters. And if I'm not mistaken, this was used as a part of the argument during the court proceedings that, look, this is not just a random case that we reported, we do have this corroborating evidence. But then, because the helicopters didn't have any markings on them, which was a part of Cash and Landrum's testimony, it was thrown out because, oh, well, we can't prove that these are necessarily connected to the government. That's a really quick explanation as I understand it, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is not just a singular sighting by a couple of people who might have concocted a story. There is corroborating information there.
Now, a point of clarification there. I mean, yes, there certainly seem to have been other people who saw these helicopters. It had not just been Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and Colby Landrum. During a later interview, because I mean, effectively what the witnesses experienced was they saw something strange, they start feeling really bad, and it was a severe enough situation that they wanted to, seek recompense, from what they presumed was some experimental technology being tested by the U.S. Air Force. I recall Betty Cash later saying, I didn't think this was some UFO. I thought this was some technology that we just were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that this had this effect on us. And so if we were injured, we should be compensated for that. I think that that's a reasonable position. But when they go to the Air Force and they conduct the first long-form interview, which was recorded, and transcripts of that entire interview can be read online, they're asked, did you see something on the helicopters? And I do think that Betty at that point says, yeah, it said U.S. Air Force. She seemed to remember pretty strongly that that's what it said. Whereas people have said, but at that time, certainly the kind of helicopter they said that they saw wouldn't have read U.S. Air Force like that. It would have been difficult for them to see it at night. And also, and this is true, I mean, UFO researchers, I think John Schuessler, who really kind of led the charge on this case, and you've reviewed his documents on this. Very extensive investigation, and that formed the basis of a book that Schuessler wrote. Schuessler, by the way, a former NASA engineer who took up this case. When, after going to the Air Force and everybody else and trying to find out, who might be responsible or who they might be able to report this to, Schuessler was, this was brought to his attention by his NASA colleagues, and he said, yeah, I'm interested, I'll investigate this. But he also was unable to find out where these helicopters would have come from. To this day, we don't know what branch of the military, if not the Air Force, would have been responsible for that many Chinook helicopters operating over the Christmas holiday at that time in the airspace. And that remains a sticking point. I have no doubt that the witnesses saw them, but whose, if not the Air Force's, had they observed.
Right, and this is also the time too, between 75 and 80, and in this range of time, that we have this rash of cattle mutilations happening across the Midwest, Texas, Colorado, Wyoming, Oklahoma, Montana, all through that area. And there was this phenomenon of these unmarked helicopters seen in correlation with these mutilated animals. In fact, John Schuessler was really looking into, they called them the choppers and the choppers, and this mysterious helicopter phenomenon. I feel like that kind of ties right into that same time frame with these copters and these unknown craft. And in fact, the diamond-shaped craft was seen in correlation with some of these mutilated animals as well.
That was my next question, is what other precedent do we know of for these diamond-shaped craft? Because I know this isn't the only case where these things have been.
There certainly are some. Now, I'll point out that researchers like Kirk Collins have gone back and looked at the original statements provided by the witnesses, and sometimes that diamond-like shape that has become so, kind of indelibly, associated with this case, it's a little questionable how distinct that shape might have been to the witnesses, because the original descriptions had just kind of been that there was, I think one had been that it was balloon-like, something that was sort of hovering over the road. Colby seems to have certainly thought that it was diamond-like, but it's interesting that he didn't, I believe, get out of the car. And one, question had it been that it appeared diamond-like to him through perhaps the glass? Betty, of course, didn't really insinuate it was distinctively diamond-shaped in her initial descriptions. I think she did later. Now, I point that out, and that's important because you look at classic UFO cases like Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier. Initially, he described kind of swept-wing, chevron-shaped objects. Maybe one was disc-shaped, but when he said that their locomotion reminded him of saucers skipping across water, the press ran with this description of flying saucers, and within a few months he even was saying, yeah, they were disc-shaped, they were saucer-shaped. So sometimes witnesses do kind of update their memories about encounters. I'm not disputing that Cash and Landrum saw an object, but there have been some researchers who have said we're not so sure if it was indeed diamond-shaped. At least some of the witness descriptions did describe it that way, and you're right, there were even other cases over Texas that described similar things. There was a kind of a diamond or top-shaped object from, I believe, in the 1960s that David Marler dug deeply into down around, I think the town was called Hobbs. And there was a young boy who saw this object moving along, and suddenly when he spotted it, it came right at him, kind of parked right over him and dropped flames, burned the child. Just a really strange case. So yeah, sort of similar in shape, though, at least to that diamond shape that's been popularly associated with Cash Landrum.
And that's an important piece too. That's an important piece too. The flame shooting out reminds me of Socorro. Yeah. So it's not the first time we see the flames.
Mm-hmm.
And Texas continues this kind of pattern of strange UFO sightings. We've talked about a few other cases. You guys mentioned some just now. I've received reports from 2 independent witnesses in San Antonio, one of which came with video of what appears to be a vertical cylinder that then separates and kind of fades from view. So Texas, it seems to have this strange legacy that is ongoing with this sort of activity. But this case is so frightening in a lot of ways. Like, it's very alarming because we think, oh, if I saw a UFO, I would probably want to run closer and get a better look at it. But maybe we should think twice about that.
Are there other cases that spring to mind with these kind of like lasting physical ramifications, like what happened with Cash Landrum?
Yeah, there are some. Falcon Lake, where we have Stefan Michalak, a Canadian observer, who he observed a landed craft, and as he approached it very cautiously, there was an opening, a door that opened on the side, and he even heard voices talking. And so he thought that they were Americans, and he goes over and kind of yells at him, "Hey, you having a problem?" And he says that the voices stop immediately, and that he's standing really close to the craft, and that as the door shuts, there's this sort of kind of like a vent, and some sort of hot steam or something, shoots out, and it blasts him, and he gets burned as well. Now, he was in direct close proximity to a craft, and there are images now that you can find online that show Michalak laying back, and he's bandaged up, but he had these areas where there were kind of these circular burns on his body.
Great on his body.
Yeah,
That's
which
really interesting.
presumably would be the shape of the exhaust area, from which this whatever it was came out of the craft. And that's not unlike the Betty Cash description. In fact, some descriptions had been that there were circular burns. And I recall reading a skeptic years ago saying that it gave them the impression that Betty had cut out holes in a piece of cardboard and placed them over her arm and put them under a sun lamp so as to create the appearance of burns. Now look, let's address that. I even had seen an insinuation on a message board that she may have drank chemicals to induce sickness so that they could convincingly make the case that they'd been injured and, thereby seek recompense from the Air Force. Are you gonna go to the great length of burning yourself, ingesting chemicals and other nonsense to try? I mean, of all the ways you could try to get money, let's almost kill ourselves and say that we were attacked by a UFO and then go to the Air Force, right?
Yeah, I'll step out of my neutral middle ground place where I've tried to stay for the duration of this show and say that sounds more insane to me than a UFO or a government experiment, because you can hear the audio of Vicki Landrum reporting this sighting to the Air Force, I believe.
Well, it was the National UFO Reporting Center, I believe. She called Robert Gribble, I believe, who still was running the hotline at that time, and she was frantically saying, "I'm afraid my friend's going to die." Yeah.
But when you listen to this audio, I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have listened to it. She sounds upset. She sounds a bit frantic. She sounds. Clearly she's been disturbed by something, but what she does not sound like is hysterical, insane, or scatterbrained. She gives very direct, decisive answers to every question that she's asked without hesitation. There's no, I think it was about like this. She's asked, was it on the road? No, sir. Was it bigger than your car? Yes, sir. And how bright was the light? It appeared like this. Like, she is 100% convinced of what she saw. And I'm sorry if I cut you off, Micah. Maybe that's the direction you were going. But that is hard for me to, not that one person would even do this, harm themselves to make up some kind of a story, but that people would corroborate it. That's...
The only other thing I'll say about that, and maybe it should be said, is that sometimes the alleged explanations that are offered for UFO cases strain more credulity than simply saying some people saw something that they couldn't explain. And in this case, I do think that the witnesses observed something, that there may be an explanation deep within the recesses of government that we don't know. I mean, I remember even talking to Stanton Friedman about this case, again, a nuclear physicist, and he said that, to him, something about this case led him to think it might be our technology. And many people have said that. I even kind of lean that direction myself. If true, it makes it all the more tragic that they were not compensated if injuries resulted from their experience.
And I've always said that. I mean, I've often asked the question, why has the Navy been so forefront and out front in this? And I know they're pulling back, and then the Air Force has been hush-hush, and I think it's a liability issue. I think especially during these years, the 70s and 80s, and people have been hurt, injured, maybe even killed, maimed, and it's, they don't want to compensate. I mean, I'm sure the list is long. So it's a liability issue, and it is tragic.
Well, if you have technology that is top secret, yet it has to be tested.
Right.
You have to test it on some things. And maybe this is indeed where the cattle mutilations come into play. This might be the case. But I think that they might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what this kind of weapon shows is it can be selectively used as a defensive weapon where it doesn't take out an entire village or anything like that. So in the theater of war, this might be a very interesting weapon. But the tragedy is that it was tested upon one of our own.
Houston today is home to multiple military installations, from training to aeronautics. Fort Sam Houston, which shares its name with the city. So there is a military presence there and has been for quite some time. So it's not unreasonable for us to speculate perhaps this is something terrestrial.
Okay, another question. There was a mention of other diamond-shaped craft seen in Texas. Were any of those like subsequent to this? Is this like, were there any, you said there's other witnesses. Well, did anyone recount seeing something similar in the days to follow or even later that same night?
There are some corollaries, and actually it's interesting. This is certainly not geographically constrained. If anything, they're on opposite sides of the world, but I think it's worth mentioning, Katie already did in fact, that within a brief 48-hour window we had Cash Landrum and the famous Rendlesham Forest incident at Suffolk. So that's interesting because some have noted that there are at least some superficial similarities between the cases. Briefly to go over those, the angular kind of shape of the craft that's observed, potential health effects on the witnesses. John Burroughs, in fact, actually did many years later receive not only I think recognition of potential health effects, and that Senator John McCain had kind of intervened to assist with that. And some saw that as being a sort of admission that there was an incident and that he had been there present and something had happened. And of course, Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum and Colby also having suffered these health effects. So although those are not similar in terms of their geographic closeness. The fact that two of the most noted UFO cases, probably not only of the 80s but of all time, happened within that window is interesting for some. As far as there being like close by similar subsequent descriptions of something like this, I don't know of any, but I'm sure that, again, you do find that kind of diamond shape in other UFO literature. Now, one last thing that should be said, because of the issue of trying to account for how a non-lethal dose of radiation could account for the health effects the witnesses suffered, some researchers have put forward ideas along the lines of maybe a chemical substance could have induced similar issues. I think Brad Sparks had been the one who proposed the idea that a chemical explanation might be better than non-ionizing radiation, which would make sense because, again, going back to the highway and looking for signs of radiation, I don't think that Schuessler was able to find any. If it were a chemical rather than a radiative kind of a phenomena that induced these health effects with the witnesses, that would maybe explain Betty Cash being more grossly affected, being outside the vehicle for longer, the lack of radiation, and all these other factors.
Do we ever know what happened to Colby through the years? I mean, did any of these witnesses have continued experiences, or, I mean, we often hear that with close encounters like this, and I'm curious if we know anything about that.
I know that Colby complained about health effects, throughout the years. I think that he, like his grandmother, who also had some issues, Betty was most adversely affected.
Right, she was out there the longest, like 5 minutes, I think.
Yeah, she suffered from a form of hair loss. She also had suffered from cancer. I think on a couple of instances, I think she had breast cancer, and ultimately, I believe she may have died due to complications from cancer. So
It's tragic, and I'm just really happy Colby stayed in the car.
yeah.
This is interesting, and you've noted this in a few cases, Katie, but again, the presence of children in proximity to this phenomena, that's another interesting aspect.
I can point out that if we're looking at cultural relevance to this case as well, this is right around the time whenever Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, and as a sign that people had encountered extraterrestrials, there was burns on their faces. That was part of the club that they belonged in to show that they had some sort of involvement in these cases.
That's right. And the ice cream cone shaped craft coming down the roads, and the diamond shape and ice cream cones, and
that takes us back to something we discussed in another episode, but it's alleged that Steven Spielberg did receive correspondence from NASA warning him against including certain things in his films because they felt it might be dangerous or harmful or something to that effect. So that's very interesting that connects to yet another case, amongst others we've discussed.
Yeah. What is it they say about art mirroring life and vice versa? Yeah. And you do see a lot of that in these UAP cases. So, again, with this case, it's a perplexing one. I mean, and I'll just put this out to the panelists. I mean, where are we in terms of what we think this might have been? I mean, if I'll go first here, I would have to say I do think this is probably one of those instances where maybe it was one of our technologies. Now, whether that technology was inspired by, reverse engineered from, or produced as a result of something else we acquired or learned of, in fact, Kevin Randall has a chapter on this case in his book on Project Moondust. Have past acquisitions influenced the creation of technologies? Could an experimental technology that we don't fully understand and we aren't fully capable of controlling, could that account for some of the issues that we're seeing with this case? Because one interpretation had been that while this thing's hovering over the road, it seems to be maybe not in distress, but at least, experiencing some sort of malfunction or technical problem, and hence the helicopters come in and escort it out. Others have said maybe it was actually a genuine UFO, and rather than being escorted, it was being pursued, followed, or what have you. To me, again, I would, and this is just my own read of the case, but I mean, it sounds a lot like our technology being escorted.
I would agree with you, Micah. And that being said, though, this also speaks to what we do to cover it up, and the fact that we're not compensating people that were injured possibly by this and affected by this is unfortunate, but I would tend to agree with you on that as well.
It doesn't exist. Right?
Yeah.
I think if this is a piece of military technology that did not function as expected, and I would wonder, we're 40 plus years removed from this incident, we still don't see anything like this. I'm not aware of any floating platforms the military has in operation that shoot flames.
Oh, I was going to say just recently, within the last year and a half, Colorado, there in Colorado Springs, we have NORAD in the Air Force Academy, Camp Carson, and we had a similar case where we had an object being escorted by military vehicles. So again, I mean, nobody was injured, it wasn't as elaborate, and I believe we closed it as a identified flying object, something of our own being escorted in, but we have had a recent case of that reported into MUFON, the Mutual UFO
So
Network.
perhaps something like this is still in development. Perhaps we're going to see more of this in the future. That's as exciting to me as anything. Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems that many of us here are of the mind that this could have been our technology. But again, that comes back to that earlier point. If this was our technology and we can't even find out whose helicopters were escorting it that night and would have been operating over the Christmas holidays, let alone why some sort of an experimental technology would be tested right around Christmas. I mean, that in itself is baffling.
And over civilians. I mean, the whole thing doesn't make a lot of sense because you're doing it over an area where there's just families, citizens.
One of the largest cities in the country, never mind the state. I mean, yeah.
It's a very odd situation.
So, I mean, again, who's accountable for that? And, I mean, I'll ask the question. If there is some branch of government, if it's a known branch, but they were carrying out some operation, and there isn't accountability and civilians are harmed, I mean, that's a huge oversight problem. And, I mean, and if that's all that this whole UFO issue ever turned out to be, we've just had our own stuff, the U.S. has an edge, but every now and then some civilians have been harmed as a result of tests, that's a problem, and it's something that has to be addressed.
I think this case is important for two reasons, because whether it is about alien contact or whether it is about a government experiment in the wrong place at the wrong time, it takes us back to something we've revisited very frequently, and that's the human element, the toll that these events take on the people that experience them. And I don't know if we can find a more striking, provable example than this incident. Like, we have records, we have times, we have dates, we have medical records. One thing that I read, one account stated that the amount of radiation was equivocal to being 3 to 5 miles from the epicenter of Hiroshima. I'm not sure how true or how possible that is. Micah discussed that.
Well, again, that would seem to indicate to me that if they had been that close to such a high yield source of radiation, I mean, it probably would have had more than just sickening effects over a long period.
And everybody in that area as well, too.
Right, that would have affected more people than just the primary.
Would the thought be here that this is a nuclear-powered object, craft?
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, if it were a chemical source that induced the sickness, perhaps there was some sort of a chemical fuel, unlike what we would use to power our rockets and things along those lines. We just don't know. I mean, there are problems, obviously, with understanding exactly what kind of technology. I'll just put it this way. There's nothing cut and dry that says, oh, that was nuclear, or this chemical was present. This is what caused the health effects. We don't really know. Something about the mechanism, presumably, that, facilitated propulsion was causing some sort of an environmental effect that affected those in nearest proximity to this object.
It could just be that radiation poisoning is as close as we can get to explaining this, because it doesn't seem, and I'm speculating here, I'm not a doctor, but do you know that? I'm not a doctor.
I don't want to be that guy, but
But I'm gonna.
Yeah, but I'm gonna still go there. So I don't think that we could always roll out balloons, because initially, whenever I hear this report, it sounds remarkably like a hot air balloon, right? That's what it sounds like to me. Even the way the fire goes, the way it kind of floats and operates. So, and because it flies silently as well, too. And because we know we have the technology, and because it was an area that was populated, I don't see any problem in suggesting that this was something that was attached to a balloon and may have, kind of went haywire, and you had to get it out of that area as quickly as possible.
Has that ever been suggested?
Well, I know a lot of UFO researchers would say, nonsense, get very offended at the very proposition that there could be a normal explanation.
There's no such thing as balloons.
But again, I mean, we have to call back to Kirk Collins, being one researcher who has pointed out that early descriptions of the object, particularly I think by Betty Cash, had been, I couldn't really see it. There was so much light coming away from it. If anything, the way it hovered, it was sort of balloon-like. That had been what she said. So, I mean, I looked into patents actually, and there was a patent that was brought to my attention from, I think, maybe 76, 77, that described a generation, kind of a mechanism of generating, propulsion for a balloon that sounded very similar, or could have been similar, to the descriptions given by Cash and Landrum. So whether indeed it was a novel form of, providing lift for a balloon that was being tested, and maybe this involved some sort of a chemical propellant or something that they happened to be there and it was leaking, there was some sort of a problem, who knows? No, I don't think we can rule that out, as much as that would probably anger a lot of people. But again, I think that when it comes to true objective study of UFOs, the sacred cows are going to get mutilated eventually, and you're going to have to leave those at the door and say, look, let's just look at the facts, and that's certainly something that could remain on the table.
Looking over all these cases and everything, what I am struck with whenever you get very deep into the UFO enigma is the humanity involved, right? So we talk about aliens and we talk about technology, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to humanity, how we view this, how we react to it, and how we place ourselves into that technology, right? I think at the end of the day, this is a very human problem, regardless if it is alien technology.
Right.
Yeah. In his Anatomy of a Phenomenon, Jacques Vallée said, we can't take a UFO and put it in the lab and study it. We can't study UFOs. We can study UFO sightings. We can study how people describe their experiences. And so really at the heart of UFO research is studying the people who have had the experience of seeing the UFO.
Absolutely.
Aside from the physical evidence and corroborating eyewitness testimony, this case is compelling for a number of reasons. While the lawsuit has concluded and the legal proceedings are long in the past, the jury is still out on the nature of what happened to Cash and Landrum.